Welcome to another episode of An Extraordinary Take, where we share extraordinary ideas and visions with extraordinary people. My name is Bo, your host, and I'm so excited that you were able to join me for this episode. Let's get into it, shall we? Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of An Extraordinary Take. My name is Sibonisile Ngubane Kosa, and it is again an incredible pleasure to be your host and to be delving into more extraordinary topics with incredible, extraordinary guests. Today, I am joined by a very how can I say this? I think I'll just say it in this way. Like, I was reading her bio and I was like, yeah, guys, some people like school. Like, some people they really do the things. Academia is, it's important, but it's not for all of us. Maybe one day the bug will get me. But, today I'm joined by Tobeka Msweli. Welcome, Tobeka.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you here, especially because of just your expertise and because of how much needed somebody like you is in the current climate. To give you guys more of an insight, Tobeka is, first of all, a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, but also she's a distinguished professional with over a decade of experience in human resources, which we know as HR. She holds a BCom honors in labor relations, a BA in industrial psychology, and she has essentially had her entire career centered around creating functional workspaces for different corporates globally and within South Africa. In 2019, after losing her corporate job due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Tobeka established her own HR consulting business called Sinombuso People Services. They're on social media, if you'd like to follow them. Currently, she serves as a senior HR specialist for a global sustainability company where she helps them with their recruiting processes, but as well as shaping the corporate culture within the company, amongst many, many other things. Welcome again, and congratulations on all the incredible things that you've done. What led you to go into the HR profession?
Thank you for having me today, first and foremost. And I love that you want to tackle this topic. So I went into the HR space by default, I'm going to be honest. The plan was to go into law. I was not accepted into law school. I had heard about industrial psychology, although not quite sure. So it was one of my options. And I ended up there. HR was one of the modules, and I fell in love with it completely, and I haven't looked back since.
What is industrial law? Or industrial, what is it?
Industrial relations.
Yeah, industrial relations. Yeah.
So basically, it's a combination of HR, management practices, and organizational design and development studies.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, I think we all, if you work at a proper company, not a spaza shop, we all have HR professionals, and usually people really hate HR because you guys do all the firing, and you get to have really difficult conversations with employees. But what would you say, and I know I'm going off script here, but what would you say really, what is the function of HR in a corporate, outside of the things that we understand it to be? Because sometimes I think we just like,
it's just these people that, when you need to fire somebody, they fire you, and it always feels like you guys are on the side of the company and not the employees. So how can you make people understand what the actual function of HR is?
Okay. I love that question. So HR is an enabler for businesses, right? So whatever the business sets out to do with its people, HR is there to ensure that they enable the business to achieve that. So through people development, through finding the right people, placing the people in the right places, aligning people's behaviors and conducts and operations in such a way that the business is able to achieve its objective. So it's an enabling function, mainly, if I can just sum it up. And I think the big reason why in most organizations you find people hate HR is where the leadership is disempowered in terms of owning certain initiatives that HR puts in place. The role of HR is not really to then drive all of these initiatives, but it's to set them up and let then the leadership of the business run with them. So in a disempowered leadership structure, you find that HR then ends up becoming the one that puts these things together and then drives them. And so it then creates a sense of we're only on one side. But again, a lot of the things that we do in terms of HR that advocate for the employees are done behind the scenes. So you wouldn't be privy to conversations where HR is pushing back on certain things with leadership and management. And even before, say, in a dismissal, you are not privy to the engagement or the discussions that are happening. And so you only get to see the end results where HR is then telling you. But again, that's a disempowered leadership or organization, because where they are empowered, HR shouldn't be driving that conversation. It should be the manager.
Okay. So essentially you should be more in the background in terms of helping the leadership to enforce certain things, but I guess probably build better relationships with their staff, so that even when you're getting to such difficult conversations, there's a sort of rapport that's been established. I think that makes sense. But the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you is I'd say it's twofold, right? I've been having so many conversations with people who, on the one hand, have been at companies for a very long time and are feeling so disgruntled because they feel like there's no growth. They feel like they're not moving up. And they feel like they've sort of like hit the ceiling. And they don't know what to do. And they're applying to other places, but they're not also being, recruited, which is interesting for me, because I always thought that, or most people think that experience is the big thing, right? So if you've been at a company for 12 years or 10 years, you would think that like that speaks well of your experience, so in that sense, you should be able to get a job easier. I don't know if that's a misconception or not. You'll correct me. So there's that one aspect. And then there are people who are in their job, but actually want to grow within the job. They're not looking to go outside. They want to grow within the corporate space, but they're being overlooked. When hires are happening, if there's a new position, the company will hire somebody externally. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is that, like, what are some of the things that keep management and HR from promoting internally and going outside for new recruits? Because often people think, I know the company, I've been here the longest, I've built relationships with people. If I'm at a low managerial position, surely if there's a new opening, surely it should be me. What are some of the things that you note that the conversations that you guys have behind the scenes where you say, this person's not right, let's look externally?
Okay. So the first thing that would make an organization look for talent externally versus internally is a skills gap.
Okay.
So if there aren't people in the organization that have those skill sets, expertise that role requires. They will look externally. Usually, again, where there's HR and things are done right, organizations should be planning for the skills that they need, and people should be developed from internally to have those skills, so that when there is a gap, then there are people to fill it. But again, the other part of it, which is the second reason, is there might not be time to develop or train internally, because the market is changing very quickly, and there's an immediate business need that needs to be filled. And so it is quicker to find the talent that is ready externally and bring them in. The third thing is, there is an element of attrition that is healthy and required in an organization to bring fresh talent, to bring people with different skill sets and expertise, and even from a culture perspective. So sometimes it is best, especially where the business is going through change, or they want to bring a new culture, bring new skills, attacking new business direction, that they would go externally. So it's a combination, but I would say those are the top 3 reasons why organizations would go externally versus recruiting from internal.
Okay. But now, so advocating for the employee now, who has been in that space, right? And feels that they are deserving of this new role. How can they, one, create better visibility for themselves within the organization, but also how can they advocate for themselves to say, guys, actually, I'm here. Like, you don't need somebody externally, because I think I would say, in my experience, there's like another way where this thing happens, where you feel like you're most qualified for the position, you feel like you've got the skills, but maybe sometimes you don't have the right attitude. And sometimes you've been in the organization for so long that you've kind of disappeared into it, which then calls into question things around, like, would you be able to assert yourself, right? Like, now you're friends with all of these people. Would you be able to assert yourself? Would you be able to really stand out? I do think a lot of the times, sometimes it has to do with the people themselves and not just their skills. But I mean, in a case where somebody really feels like they deserve this new role and they're seeing that it's being advertised, and that they're looking, or they seem to be leaning more towards an external party, what are some of the things that somebody can do to say, what about me?
Okay. I love that question, and I love the fact that earlier you said, how can they advocate for themselves? I think the mistake that people often make is to leave their development to chance. That it will just happen. I'm just going to keep working. It's just going to come to me. One day I'm going to get a letter saying, hi, congratulations, you're promoted. And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. You yourself firstly need to know what it is you want next, and be intentional in terms of, how do I get that? And that's not like at a high level saying, I want to be a manager. Which division? Where do you want to be a manager for? Do you understand the requirements of the thing that you want next? What skills, what experience is required? Because once you are able to define that and articulate it for yourself, you can then advocate for it better. By one, most organizations have goal setting process, KPI setting process, and usually those discussions also focus on talking about a person's development and how they're doing. So once you have that understanding of what you want, you can then bring it into those conversations. And you need to be honest in those conversations to say, hey, I want to be a manager next, right? And then that will also give you an opportunity for whoever is your current leadership or manager to give you feedback, to say, okay, these are the gaps that I think you still have from becoming a manager. And then you put together a development plan. So it's intentioned that, okay, we're developing you to become a manager. And again, that is not a promise that you're going to be a manager in that organization, but it at least ensures that the experience and the opportunities and the development that you're getting is then aligned, so that even if it's not in the same organization, you are better equipped to get that opportunity. And then over and above that, a very big part of progressing, especially within the organization that you're in, is how you show up in your current role. Are you a strong performer? Do you consistently meet and exceed expectations? Because if you're an inconsistent performer or a poor performer, there's not a chance that you're going to get that opportunity. So being a strong performer will play to it, but also not just being a strong performer, but being able to identify opportunities that add value. So you're not just ticking boxes in your current job. There are people who believe that they're doing their job and so they should be promoted. But people don't get promoted simply for doing their job. You get paid to do your job. Promotion is for people who go the extra mile, who show initiative, who show certain behavior. So whilst doing my job, am I able to say, hey, manager, I noticed this and I think this is a gap and I think we can do this differently, or I think there's a way that I can think of. That sort of thinking will really, really show that you are one who has the potential and the capacity to be stretched and to bring more. And it's also then about how you model the culture and the behavior of that organization.
Sure.
So how do you behave, right? Because there are people who perform, but how they go about it leaves much to be desired.
Give me an example.
So, for example, yes, you come to work, but you're always late. Yes, you will do the task, but you're always there. People need to follow up with you. You do the work, but sure, the people that work with you are like, you're terrible. It's terrible working with you. You don't know how to speak. You don't have accountability. So behavior as well plays a part in terms of those opportunities, whether you are going to be considered or not. And I think then the last thing, over and above the behavior, the performance, the capability, is then also having someone lobby for you.
Yeah.
It's very important to have that one person in the organization. Not everybody has to see you because depending on the space that you're in, someone may not completely be able to see the value that I'm driving. But if I'm working with a particular leadership team or people, if one person can see and recognize that, that is good to have, because then in a room where decision needs to be made about who to promote, it's not just me saying, pick me, but someone is saying, hey, have you had a look at Tobeka? You know, I've worked with them and they possess such and such abilities.
Yeah, I love that you said that. My boss, late, he's late now. Jay Badza used to say, like, you need a sponsor.
Yes.
And that's the person who's somewhat already also in a leadership position, and who has a voice in the organization, where you can go to them and you can say, listen, this is where I want to grow, right? Because I think a lot of the times, some people feel it's not that simple, in the sense that you could have a manager who doesn't like you. You could have a manager who's gunning for their own things, who only cares about their own upward mobility, who only cares about getting themselves to where it is that they want to go. So I think that idea that you've spoken about opens it up a little bit more, right? To say, who can you go to in the organization where you can say, I think this person can help me out, right? And to have the conversation with them to say, look, I like where you are. And one, I want to grow, obviously, but how can you assist me? What are some of the things that you see in me that maybe could be a hindrance, right? To my growth, so that person can kind of start whispering in the right ears, and it might not be a thing that happens within 6 months or even a year. I think a lot of the times, as professionals, we don't know the importance of playing the long game. Of coming into an organization and kind of going like, okay, I've got goals here, and this is how I'm going to start. And I think even to add to that is to say, you spoke initially about like that you need to have goals, right? I think they have to be linked to like personal and work. And not all of them have to. I think when you just say to get promoted, it really limits, how far you can get. I think you almost have to look at it as like a step ladder. Where you're like, okay, maybe the first one is build better relations with management.
Absolutely.
And I think that's probably a goal that most people would overlook. So you're like, get promoted, but you're missing so many steps. Work on my communication skills, work on, how I show up, work on my wardrobe, like things like that. Because then essentially what you're saying to yourself is, okay, what are the kind of people that are in these leadership spaces? What do they look like? How do they show up? How do they speak? And then you kind of set your own step ladder of goals for yourself to, before getting to that promotion. And that leads me then to my next question of, for me, I've had the great pleasure of leading quite a number of teams, and I think what I've always found to be lacking within workspaces is accountability in employees. I think, and this is not at all to say that like terrible work environments don't exist. Trust me, there's so many. But I often find that when we're talking about toxic work environments, it's almost like this thing, you can't pinpoint it like, this is such a toxic work environment, but we don't talk about what kind of characteristics show up that make for a toxic work environment. We don't talk about what are some of the things that we do as employees that contribute to a toxic work environment. And I know that there's so much that we can do, and there's so much that you as HR have to do in fixing the company and ensuring that the company has, a good culture and things like that. But first of all, I want us to define, what would you say constitutes a toxic work environment? Because I think it's a word that, everybody uses, and I don't know if it's always true. So what constitutes a work environment? And then I want us to get into things that like we as employees do that lead to that toxic work culture.
Okay. Sure, you're touching on touchy.
Yeah, I know. But I think it's important to talk about.
Absolutely.
People are in a work environment.
Absolutely.
Right. So when you say it's toxic, it's giving people must be making it toxic, but nobody comes out and says, I've never spoken to anyone who said, me actually, like I'm the toxic one at work. They're always saying that they work in a toxic environment. Everyone works in a toxic environment, but I've never met a single person that is taking accountability or saying I'm the reason that it's toxic, which makes me feel like we're having a one-sided conversation around this.
I love that as part of your question, you've already alluded to people and behaviors. And so when we talk about toxic work environments, it can become a very subjective topic. And when you talk about human beings and behaviors, it can be also very nuanced. But what I can say is that a toxic work environment is not a bad day at work. It's not a tough relationship with a colleague. That's not a toxic work environment.
Okay. Say those two things again.
A toxic work environment is not a bad day at work, and it's also not a difficult colleague.
Okay, sure. Okay.
A toxic work environment, for it to be a toxic work environment, let me put it this way, there needs to be a consistent pattern of behaviors that are negative to a point that it impacts people's performance, productivity, and well-being.
Okay.
So that's how I would define a toxic work environment, where the behaviors, and when I say behaviors, I'm not talking about just leadership. I'm talking about the behaviors of both leaders and employees. They have to be consistent in such a way that people are now feeling unsafe, be it psychologically unsafe. People are feeling unsupported. People are feeling unproductive, not able to develop, not able to communicate, just stifled. It stifles the growth, it stifles productivity and everything else. That is a toxic work environment.
So when you don't like one of your colleagues, it's not a toxic.
No, shame. It's not toxic. And when you've had a difficult day, a difficult conversation, an uncomfortable situation, you don't go home and say, yo, what a toxic work environment. You go home and you say, what a tough day it was today.
Sure. Look, I think that's so important, because I do think this language does then also cause us to really feel so depressed in our work, but also to not even over analyze, but blow things out of proportion.
We go to the extremes.
You go to the extreme where you maybe didn't perform that well in a particular task, and you're called out for it, and then you say you're in a toxic work environment. And I like that you pointed out like very key things that make a work environment toxic, which is to say, if it's stifling your productivity, if people are feeling unsafe, if people feel like they can't be themselves, you can't laugh, you can't, but often like I'll find that I'll go into an office where it's fun and people are enjoying each other and they're talking nicely and the boss is quite, amicable. But the moment that somebody is going through a disciplinary action or somebody is called out for certain behaviors, go. And I think then what then happens is, I think the biggest thing is new people come in. And now you've got this cohort of people who have decided, because they've been disciplined for certain things, or maybe they wanted a promotion and they were passed up for it because, like you said, they didn't have the skills, or because they were lacking in certain behaviors and in showing up. When new people come, they're like, hey, this is very toxic. Good luck. We're giving you 6 months. Then there's these other things. I think I really want to get into this toxic behavior, because I've seen different elements of it. For example, where somebody new comes in and they're so excited and they're like walking on sunshine and they can't wait to make changes. And when there's meetings, they're raising up their hand and they're saying, oh, I noticed this, like they're being proactive. And I think we should do this. And then you get Ismolanyana group there that's like, where siyambuka nje. It's like, clearly, she's still new. She thinks nothing ever changes in this organization. Uzobon. I think that is so toxic. Yeah. And I think that leads to making the environment even more toxic, because now you've got new people who could potentially change things and you're not allowing them to do so because of your own disgruntlement. Why do people let's talk about that particular aspect, because I think those people don't even recognize that they're being toxic, right? They don't even recognize that, because it can be valid, right? You could have had a few, things that rubbed you off the wrong way that don't constitute for a toxic work environment. But then your perception around the thing is now you've called it toxic. So when new people come who could make a positive contribution to the organization, you then turn that thing around because you already feel some type of way. How can people recognize? Maybe let me rephrase. How do you know that you're the toxic employee?
Sure. I want to say this, right? That, toxic work environments do exist.
Yes.
And we in no way want to minimize that experience.
Yeah.
But there's a step after recognizing the pattern of behaviors that make the workplace environment toxic is what you then do. People often leave it at, I've noticed this behavior. I've noticed this. I'm going to stay silent and suffer until I can't anymore. And then they leave, and then it's explosive. And then they want to say all these things about that organization.
And they've never even spoken to anyone who actually can do something about it.
Exactly. So I think it's very important to call it out, call the behaviors out, have the conversations. And again, that is where HR comes in. That is where then you'll see HR partnering with employees. The reason why you feel like maybe HR doesn't partner with employees is because when a manager is having a problem with a person, they will go to HR. And so HR will then be able to give them the guidance and the support that they need to address it. But when an employee is feeling like they're having a problem, seldom do they go
to HR
and get the support and guidance that they need. But going back to your question now about how to spot these behaviors of a toxic employee. I'm going to keep it framed within the organizational context because, again, it can be very subjective what we consider as toxic.
Yeah.
Organizations have a set of policies and operating procedures which govern the way things should be done and how things should work. Organizations have a set of values that they want to model. So there's a way, and that's why we talk about a culture. There's a way in which things are done. There's established rules and regulations. Those are intended to align behaviors because we're so different, we're so diverse.
Yeah.
It's intended to bring alignment and some sort of uniformity in terms of how do we go about this? If you've got a problem, how do you go about tackling it? And so I would say one of the first ways, without being subjective, to spot behaviors that can be toxic is behaviors that are not consistent with the values, with the policies, with the procedures of the organization.
Can I be honest? Like, as you're saying this, like I'm having a light bulb moment because, again, I think accountability is such a big thing. And I will say, and I will speak for myself, those things, the values of the organization, the behaviors, you read them when the recruitment process is happening and you're signing your contract, and you never open that thing ever again. Which I think, now that you're saying that, is so interesting, because if you went and asked people in a work environment to say, what kind of values does this company stand for? Which is to say, how should we be treating each other? Like, what are the specifics? Because companies go really deep into that, and they go specific in terms of how do you problem solve? How do you escalate? How do you get to an escalation process? But also, what kind of characteristics, what is the culture? And I think people come as themselves. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, but I think there is you, and then there is also the persona of the company. And you have to morph into that as far as you can, because yes, you are Tobeka, yes, you are Sbo, but if the company culture is this, then it means that if I, for example, am I would maybe call myself, and this is usually rude people, like I'm very upfront. I call things what they are. Is that part of the company culture?
The company culture can say, well, we treat each other with respect, right? So in your assertiveness, in your communication style, how do I then package and structure my communication in a manner that promotes and aligns with the respect that is promoted in the workplace? And so that is why organizations very often will talk about their values and the culture, and they will do surveys to check if those cultures are actually the lived experience of employees. But it's very important for you to also engage with that communication and material to understand it so that you can also live it. Right. And, you know, speaking of all those structural things that are in place, I will also go a step further and say there's also certain behavioral patterns that can be associated with someone who then can be the one creating a toxic environment. And I'll say three easy ones. The first one is not being able to give and receive feedback. It's a major thing. And that's where often the toxicity will come up from either end, where you don't know how to give feedback constructively and you don't know how to receive feedback constructively.
So these are now the traits of how you can know that you might be the toxic, or that you are,
or that the person is toxic. Not being able to give and receive feedback constructively. A lack of accountability, like you so said earlier. You can never own up, oh, I made a mistake, or this, I dropped the ball. I'm sorry, I didn't understand this. This was my task. You always want to play the blame game.
You're never wrong.
Yes. And then another thing is, over and above not being able to take accountability, you're not reliable. You're an inconsistent performer. You're a poor performer. People can't count on you, you know, and that you can see very quickly. You'll know people in your team where you're like, this one, you know, this one is just ticking boxes, or they like taking shortcuts, or they're unethical sometimes in the way that they go about their work. That can create a toxic, work environment. And that is to say just those three things, because we don't work in silos, although we have specific work that we do, but it often is a cycle. It connects to the next person's job and the next person's job. And so, for example, if you're constantly dropping the ball, it can breed toxicity because someone has to pick that up. Or it impacts the next step in the process, right? So those are some of the things that you can, you know, quickly see that this pattern of behavior actually is toxic.
Yeah, I actually, and as I'm thinking about it, I think it's actually so easy to become a toxic employee. And I think it happens at the drop of a hat, and it happens without you even knowing it. Because, for example, what you said is so key. And I've seen this so many times, the not being able to take accountability. I can get where that comes from, right? Because work is it's a performance driven, space. So it's not even like a relationship where you can go to your partner, or you can say to a child, I messed up here. Actually, I'm so sorry. And so it can start from a place of fear, right? Being afraid to own up to a mistake that you made, because you're scared, right? You're scared that you might lose your job, or you're scared that your team might see you differently. And then it just becomes your persona, where whenever you've made a mistake, you have to find something else or someone else to blame it on. And then this actually becomes part of your behavior system, where you are now actually a toxic person, because somebody could say, man, this thing was due at this time. The client says they haven't received it. Haibo, no, then it must have been whoever. So you're defensive. And I think a lot of people are like that, but they wouldn't see themselves as toxic. But you're pointing out that actually makes you toxic. Another part of it is not being able to receive or give feedback. I can completely understand where that comes from, right? We're coming from all kinds of different homes where there wasn't like, we didn't have a safe space where somebody could say, hey, mama, you didn't do that well. You know, let's go. Like the criticism was so harsh.
Yeah, it was not constructive.
It was not constructive, or they would beat you up, or whatever the case is. And so you've developed the skin, and these walls where the moment somebody says, hey, can we chat about what happened yesterday? You're already like, what happened yesterday?
Yes.
You know, and it's like, then people feel like they can't talk to you. They can't get through to you. But again, that armor makes you a toxic employee. And so I do think that these things are behaviors that stemmed from outside of the workplace that we show up in. Again, everything is trauma driven, that show up in the workplace, and you could be looking around and just thinking like, oh, this manager hates me. This manager is always out to get me. But it's actually because you've never learned, you've never been nurtured where you have felt that you could get feedback and it's okay, where you felt like your parents can reprimand you, but they still love you. You were reprimanded in such a way that it made you feel like you were worthless. It made you feel like you're not good enough. And so even when you do have a good manager, even when you do have a manager that can constructively, you know, have conversations with you, you can't receive it.
Yes.
Because you're so, you know, and that's why I really, even when I was thinking about this, I was like, a lot of the times, really, if we had introspective people, if we had self-aware people in our workplaces, I think the toxicity of these work cultures would lessen so much.
Absolutely.
Because what is happening is you've got these people just beating up against each other.
Absolutely.
And nobody's saying, okay, what could I have done to contribute to this? Because I always, and the people I worked with hated this about me, where I would always say, I don't believe that there can be a situation where that went wrong and you are 100% right.
Absolutely.
I think it is impossible that whether you're a manager, whether you're whatever, there's no way that there isn't even a 5% accountability that you can take from there. How can you as an employee work on now you've realized, maybe I might be the problem. I might be the problem. And sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes it's because you are because I will say, being in a toxic work culture doesn't mean you have to be toxic.
Yes.
And I think this is the thing that we struggle with the most, is we feel like now we must go with the grain and whatever. Yes. I really think it's important for you to maintain who you are. So now that you've noted that these things have filtered into you, either you came to them because of how you were raised, which is more probable than not, or it was a culture itself that turned you like this. Especially with the feedback thing. What are some of the things that we can do to better receive feedback?
Okay. So I want to acknowledge that feedback is not always constructive. So, and I intentionally use the word give and receive feedback constructively because there is a manner that feedback can be given that can trigger a negative response.
Yes.
And so with anything, I go back, there's a saying that says, those who survive are people who have the ability to learn, relearn, and unlearn new things. And so even in an experience where you are receiving feedback negatively, there is an opportunity where you can learn how to manage someone who doesn't give feedback constructively. And these are things that, are available. You can go on Google. There's tools, there's resources to learn how to communicate better, right? So you can empower yourself. Like you were saying earlier, we want to jump to the promotion, but there's so many steps we're missing. Part of my development is learning how to communicate better and to receive feedback. So then I'm able to, in that situation where maybe that feedback is not given constructively, to be able to redirect that conversation. And again, one of the simple ways, and this is something I've exercised before, where I feel like the feedback that I was being given was not being given constructively, to say, could I ask that we not have this conversation now? I would also like to prepare myself for the conversation. So in essence, I'm saying in a very professional way, we're not going to do it now, and we're not going to do it this way.
Yeah.
So you take ownership of that conversation. And then when you do have the conversation, keeping an open mind, nobody, even I myself saying this, nobody likes to be given feedback, even if it's constructive, but telling you where you have done wrong or where you have fallen short. Nobody likes it, but we need it so that we can be able to grow. And so it's important to be open to receiving that feedback. And unless you're open, no matter how constructive or how well packaged that is, it's going to go over your head if you're not open to thinking and receiving it. So I would say, also be the one that knows how, because you can't expect from people things that you cannot do yourself. Learn yourself how to communicate better, and then be open to that communication channel.
I like that, because I think it leads me to my next question, but I do think it brings back the onus on you.
Yes.
To say, okay, what can I do? It's something that I used to say with my team, because we had an escalation process, and I'd say, before you come to me with an escalation, I need you to have at least tried 3 times to resolve this on your own. So I need you to come to me to say, so the first time, this is what I did. The second time, this is what I did. And all times it didn't work. Then that constitutes bringing me into the conversation.
Yes.
But I think oftentimes we really don't allow ourselves to figure out, like, how can I reshape this conversation? But also, I think when you have toxic employees or colleagues, really, there is a way that you can nip certain things in the bud.
Absolutely.
Right. So, for example, if you've got somebody, like you had said, who you're on the field and you're working, and they immediately start shouting, and which is to say they're not giving this feedback constructively.
Yes.
That is then where you would say, can we have, like, I understand you're frustrated.
Yes.
Would it be possible for us to have this conversation at another time?
Yes.
As I would also like to prepare, like you said. And I think things like that also help you assert yourselves better, but also help show others how you want to be treated.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the times we get so disgruntled, and we're like, well, I'm going to give the same energy that I'm getting. And it's like, you don't actually always have to. You can really remain cordial. Sometimes it's not possible. I've had moments where I've lost my cool.
Absolutely.
Because I'm just like,
human.
Gunini, kuluma about this thing. But I think even then it's also important how you come back.
Absolutely.
Even as a manager, right? To say, hey, earlier, I feel like I really lost my cool. I understand why I did, but I wish that I would have had the conversation a little bit better. Can we set up time to talk about this? And these are really key small things, that sometimes I think as employees we're missing, because, and there's a reason why I'm having this conversation from an employee perspective and not so much from the work environment, because there's certain things that you can't change, but you can change how you respond.
Absolutely.
And you can change how you show up. And so it's really about equipping ourselves with the tools to be able to say, how do I deal with a toxic employee? How do I deal with a toxic colleague? To say, the moment that you see that they're now losing it, and you say, would you like some time? can we maybe take a beat and come back to this? What are some of the ways that we can, especially from a leadership perspective, right? How can you help somebody that you can see is really struggling with receiving feedback, is really struggling with taking accountability? What are some of the ways that you can show them, Uba? I think, because you can't say, I think this is your trauma speaking.
Yeah.
Like, I think now you're projecting, like, I think this is your trauma speaking, but how can we support? Because the reality, and I think particularly as Black people, right? The reality is we're working with all kinds of people who have received and who have gone through all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Whether in family, whether in different work cultures, where really what you're dealing with is like wounded beings who just feel like the little girl in them or the little boy in them is constantly acting out. And I do feel like as managers, maybe who are at a better space in terms of like, emotional, intelligence, I do think there is a role, man, that we can play to support one another, to see somebody and to say, you actually have great potential, but kunale anger or kunale, you are like, you can't receive feedback, but you're always, what's the word? You're always defensive. How can you take somebody to the side? How can you help employees who do have potential, but have become toxic because of either how they were raised or because of previous work environments?
I like that perspective, right? Because in as much as we're saying employees have the responsibility themselves to manage and shape their experiences, but leaders do play quite a strong role in crafting the experience for the person in the workplace. And so to your question, I would say it's important, firstly, that you as the leader or the manager have the skills and capability to manage people. And it's not to say that you come in ready with them, that you are born with them, but that you continuously develop them. Take up courses, do 360 feedbacks, know your blind spots.
What's 360 feedback?
So a 360 feedback is you can do it via conversations, anonymously through a survey, but it's where you get feedback from people all around you. So not just the people that you work with. So you can say, I'm going to take my team, give me feedback, the leaders that I work with, and maybe a few clients, ask them for some feedback. That gives you a wider view of some of the things that you'd want to get a sense of how they're doing. But then as a manager or as a leader, I think leader is a better word. It's important not to have one approach. And that's why the whole conversation of leadership style is irrelevant, because not one style works for the same person. And so
learn your people,
understand them, and then tailor your approach to suit them. Will that always be possible? No. But in certain opportunities, you can say, okay, I don't want to end up in a situation where I don't hear from this person in a meeting. I know that this one is the quieter in the team. I know that there's a Tobeka who is the blabbermouth in the team. So I'm going to be intentional in asking this person for their feedback, in asking them to make a contribution so that they're not then a silent member of the team. Or I'm going to schedule regular one-on-ones with them, check-ins, because I know that they are maybe not so proactive and assertive, like Tobeka, who can walk into my door at any time and tell me what she thinks or that she would like to speak to me. So I'm going to set up one-on-one catch-ups with this person with no agenda, really, even if it's informal, even if they say they're fine, but I'm going to take the time to say, how are you? How are things going? Is there anything that you want to chat about? And as well as knowing how to give the right opportunities for those people, right? There's a project. I know that this person enjoys more working with numbers, for example. So I'm going to involve them in this project versus someone who doesn't. So it's really about understanding your people and then tailoring your approach to them. A simple example. You can't go back and forth on someone on emails. And we do that sometimes. On the same topic 5 times. At some point, you got to stop and say, we're misunderstanding each other. Let's get on a call. Let's meet. You're in the same office. You're emailing each other back and forth. Especially as a leader, you can't be doing that. At some point, you got to stop and say, okay, let me pick up the phone and call this person. Hey, I sent the email. Is there anything that you didn't understand? Or can you maybe explain how you are interpreting what I'm saying? So we definitely can be open-minded and flexible in terms of how we are going to do things.
I think you hit it on the nail there. And I think my other philosophy about being a manager, I think a lot of the times we all want really these high leadership positions when we are not leaders. In the sense that we can't lead ourselves, and in the sense that we have a very low EQ. And I think going back to what we were talking about, wanting to be promoted and things like that, I really do think that you have to really have such a high awareness level where you can say, like, how do I feel about people? If you're a manager and you don't like people, it doesn't make sense, because what I really believe about leadership, and this is not to say, I would like to think that those who I have led, the majority of them would attest to this in my leadership style, is I really believe that as a leader, you are called to more. In that, you're always called to take the higher road.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how terrible you think the other person is. There are people who would say, I've definitely lost my temper because I was just at my wit's end. But for the most part, even with working with other managers, I've always said, you have to always come from the place of, like, there's a reason why you are chosen as a leader. And there's a reason why they're not the leader. Which is to say, you almost have to expect for them to be irrational. You almost have to expect for them to not understand or not see the bigger picture, which means you need to bring them along on the journey to show them, Uba, Sbanmani, this is what we're doing. And to literally almost lower yourself. It's like being a parent.
Absolutely.
And what psychologists will say is, like, sometimes you need to go on your knees when you're talking to a child and be level with them so that they don't feel like you're towering over them. That's another massive aspect of leadership, is we sometimes use these leadership positions as a way to tower over people and as a way to show and enforce, Uba, I'm better than you. And in that way, we don't bring them up with us. So what does it look like to realize, Uba, you've got an employee and actually currently they're throwing a tantrum and you are the parent in the situation, for you to actually get to their level and to say, I understand you're frustrated because your colleague did 1, 2, and 3. And let's talk a little bit about that. I think you really have to have the heart for it. You almost have to, you're a psychologist, you are a manager, you're a parent, you're all kinds of things. And I think that's what makes for a good manager. And if you don't have those skills, if you don't have that patience with people, you can't equip them to be better. You can't equip them to grow. But then I would also say, on the other hand, I really want to throw this out to employees. I had a guest, and we're talking more about marriage, and we're talking about how you have to, expect. You don't just have to expect accountability. You have to ask for it. And you have to be willing to receive it. And what I want to say to that is, go ask for feedback. Unscheduled. So that is to say, going to different employees and say, what do you think of me? Can you be honest? And that's when you'll know that you really want to grow in an organization. If you really struggle with asking or with receiving feedback, make yourself uncomfortable by literally going outside of your comfort zone and going to ask somebody, can you please give me feedback on my leadership style if you're the leader? Or can you please give me feedback on just me? Like, what do you think of me? And I promise I'm not going to take offense. And I think that then already allows you to grow your discomfort levels, right? To be able to sit with it. Because I think when you're not proactive about it, you're always going to be caught off guard. But the best thing you can do for yourself, this is my favorite thing. And these are like we have favorite team members, but my favorite types of team members have always been the ones who come to me before I come to them, who say to me, what's your feedback for me? What do you think about this? How could I have done better? How could I? And then by the time the feedback comes, you have a little bit of a thick skin for it. So I think don't sit back. Be proactive about receiving feedback, and then your system, you're going to grow your tolerance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to say you're quite right when you said earlier that not everybody is a leader. And sometimes organizations make the mistake of hiring people purely on performance and not considering the people aspect. But most organizations who know better will go as far as before hiring someone in a leadership position, they'll do a personality test, a leadership test to sort of see whether they're suited. I also want to say it's okay, even as an individual, to know yourself, to have that self-awareness to say, actually, I'd love to grow in my career, but maybe to a specialist role, but I don't want to lead people. You know,
I don't have the heart for it.
Yeah. And I'm not yet at a place where I am open to developing myself in that way. Because that will also help you, right? Because, it will save a lot of people the headache and the trouble of experiencing the unfortunate end or the consequence of that. But to answer your question around, you know, leadership and how they are able to then, you know, help people in terms of these behaviors that we see in the workplace and the feedback, I think it's important, like you were saying, that feedback needs to be a culture. It needs to be continuous. It's not at the end of the year when we do performance reviews. Because then obviously I'm going to be shocked and frustrated.
When we are fronted.
We're talking about something that happened 7 months ago. I've had no opportunity to correct. Continuous feedback culture is what actually creates a good working environment, because it means we don't let things go on too long unchecked, especially if something is not right. So having continuous feedback loops, and to your point, having informal feedback discussions, not just the formal ones. And it is going to be uncomfortable, right? But it will help. I remember the first time I got feedback around some of my communication techniques, and it felt a bit uncomfortable because for me it felt justified. I maybe responded to an email in a particular way. But the moment I sat with it, and then not only did I sit with it, but then I started to check myself. So there was a time where before I sent an email, especially where I felt I was a bit triggered emotionally by it, I would send it to my manager to say, please review. We're lucky now. We've got things like Copilot, AI to say, help me make this nicer. Help me make this more professional. You know, we've got those tools to leverage, but feedback then gives you an opportunity to get the help. And if someone is willing to give you the feedback constructively, I can tell you very often that person is willing to actually give you the support as well. Because if I've got the time to say, I don't like this, it means that I've got an interest in continuing this relationship in a particular way. And so how do we find a way to do this in a better way for both of us? And so
that's very good.
It will be uncomfortable. Sit with it, work through it, and then continue. It's not a once-off exercise. I'm not going to get it right the first time. Sometimes even today, I can still send an email to my manager and she'd be like, take out a whole paragraph.
Yeah, that's not you. It's giving aggressive.
It's giving aggressive. Tone it down.
Yeah.
So and this is just one simple example.
Yeah.
But again, there could be a more structured approach to say, okay, I've received the feedback. This is an improvement. I'm now putting a plan. Again, to your point.
Yeah.
Not everything is an overnight and a quick thing.
Yeah.
When we talk about development and progress and achievement, we always wanna attach it to like a quick thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a progress. Sometimes this is something I'm going to work on for the next 6 months. But I am going to work on it and I am going to see the needle move. So the 360 today might show that, this is sitting on red. 6 months from now, it might be sitting on orange and not necessarily green, but it is showing me that I'm at least improving and I can then take it to the next level.
100%. I love that so much. And I think the biggest takeout really from this is, one, the importance of thickening your skin to be able to give and receive feedback constructively, allowing yourself to be able to take accountability, really, really taking pause and being able to, really take a second to say, could I have done this better? Is there any way where actually I dropped the ball here? Like, I understand that I think this was maybe this person's responsibility, but could I have maybe checked up a little bit earlier? Could I have maybe been a little bit more proactive? Would that have helped? And then also, you spoke about being reliable, and not just to your managers, but to your colleagues as well.
Yes.
That's really important in fostering a healthier work environment. And even if you're doing these 3 things just within your team, I think that would make such an incredible difference.
I think more often when people talk about toxic experiences, it's very rare that it's outside of their teams. People interact with their teams mostly, more than anything or anyone in the organization. And so if we can get it right with our people, with our teams, then that becomes a ripple effect through the rest of our interactions and our engagements.
100%. I really like that. And we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask you, because this is it's such a big thing. There are, people who are unemployed. We have crazy unemployment rates in South Africa, which is a huge governmental issue, but also, then there are also people who are employed who really want to get out. What are like a few tips that you can give? I know on your platform, Sinombuso People Services, you speak a lot around like how people curate their LinkedIn, how people curate their CVs, things like that. How can people better set themselves up for success?
Okay. I think that one of the ways in which people can set themselves up for success is, again, going back to my earlier point, knowing what that success is, what it looks like for them. I know that when it comes to unemployment, it's so sensitive and people can get to a point where they just like applying for anything and everything. But it's not in applying for everything and anything that you apply. In fact, you're going to feel like you're being rejected more because you're probably applying for more opportunities that are misaligned rather than applying for the opportunities that you're aligned for. So be very clear in what it is you're looking for and how you are positioning yourself for it. There's also another part to it, right? Being versatile. I think it's such a big thing and we forget it, right? You find that a person has studied one particular thing, but there's no openness to diversify their skills, take up another short course to bridge this, or because maybe there's more opportunity in that space and so they're going to go into that. People are very much stuck in one thing, right? And so to survive this environment, this economy, you got to be versatile. Hence, at some point, I've been in consulting, and at some point, I've been in corporate. You need to be able to read what is happening and see what you have and how you can use that in the current market. And so sometimes it looks like coming into the organization as a receptionist, even though you know you've got a supply chain qualification.
Sure.
And then showing up in that opportunity until something else opens, right? So you need to be versatile and be able to position yourself for different opportunities. I'd also say, and this is a very blanketed approach, right? And I'd say people must take this feedback, obviously, with the context, that we are having just a generalized conversation. Take up opportunities for short courses. They go so much further than you could imagine. Because what sets me apart today from someone who's just done an HR qualification that I have is not just the experience, but it's the add-ons. That, not only do you have HR, but you've got an advanced analytics course. These are courses that you can do whilst you're unemployed. Some of them are free. Some of them are a small fee, which maybe you might be able to pay, because then as a plug-on, as an addition, it makes you so much more suited, because it is a highly competitive environment. And so you got to make sure that whatever way that you can enhance your chances, that you are doing that.
Okay. I like that. And I think I'll add one thing that actually worked for a friend of my husband. So he had been unemployed for a while, and at some point my husband just said, just go to a company and ask them to hire you. Tell them they don't need to pay you. Just tell them you just want experience. You've got nothing to lose. You're already not working. Just tell them you want this experience so that you can better equip yourself. You're just here to learn. You're here. They can throw you wherever they want you. And literally within a couple of months, they hired him. So it took a sacrifice on his part to say, I'm going to work for no money. But I do think sometimes, especially if you're unemployed, you have to be willing to do the hard things. And I think a lot of the times we're so disgruntled because you're like, I've got this degree in Dondoni. I'm not going to do work that isn't aligned to this or whatever. But I like what you said about, like, you might have a diploma or a degree in something else, and then you get your foot in the door at the company that you want to work for by being a receptionist. And I do think you have to be a lot more open-minded, even actually when you're trying to transition outside of one sort of career or one space where you were maybe in marketing, but now you want to go into something else. You might have to let the big title go, just so that you can get your foot in the door. And I think those are things that we don't look at often because we don't have career growth plans.
I recently read an article from a study that was done by a particular bank. And they've come out and said that when South Africa is doing a statistical research in terms of unemployment, they are only recording people with formal employment, and they're not considering people with informal employment and people who are self-employed. And they are arguing that if we take that into consideration, it might likely
then it's not as bad.
It's not as bad, right? And it's an uncomfortable point or stance that they are taking on. But to that point, I said, I agree with this because I've never allowed myself to be unemployed, to have a blank in my CV. Even when I was outside of formal employment due to retrenchment, for example, like during COVID, I still said, what am I going to do with this time? And so there isn't a blank page on my CV. So just like you, even as a graduate who's still in school, your CV is writing itself in terms of what are you doing now? Are you working a part-time job? Are you participating in programs in the institution? Do you have a leadership role? That is not a blank page. That all goes to your experience and how you're growing. It's shaping you as a person. And then you can be able to position that strategically on your CV to get the opportunities. So don't allow yourself to say, it's blank. I'm doing nothing. Yes, I may not have formal employment, but what am I doing informally? What else can I do outside of what I know and what I want? And then how do I position that? I can go serve at a church and they could give me actually a reference letter to say, yeah, you've served. She did admin. She did this. There's so many opportunities. We must be open again and versatile to exploring them and then using them to our advantage.
100%. And I like that because that's an empowerment. You have to empower yourself. And I think it's not to say, I think sitting at home and being disgruntled and complaining, I love what you said because you've gone through retrenchment. You've gone through, that, which is very hard and very uncomfortable. But to say, okay, what am I going to do? To call up people and say, hey, can I assist you with 1, 2, and 3? You don't have to pay me. You don't have to do, but people literally, I think we really are so complacent, and someone will say, I am not going to do something for free. You've got all the time, sir. You're doing nothing. How can you really make better use and not have gaps in your CV? That is so helpful. Do you have any closing points with regards to this? Because this is us saying goodbye. There's so much to talk about, and we definitely might probably even do a part 2. But I do think that all the things that we touched on are so key and can be so helpful.
I think as a last point, I want to say to anyone and everyone, do not be resistant to change in your current workplace. If you're in the workplace, even externally, observe the market. What is happening in the market directly impacts the opportunities that are going to be available. What technology is coming up? What are the buzzwords that you keep hearing in your field? What are people talking about that is sounding foreign to you? Get closer to it. Don't run from it. Be curious about what is this that people keep talking about? How does this impact me? People are talking about AI. How does this impact me? How do I get on board on this? Be curious, want to be in on things, right? And that will make such a big difference in terms of your strategy and your ability to then recraft and create how you show up and how you position yourself for opportunities. So be curious, ask the questions, observe the market, and set yourself up for the success that you want to achieve.
That's it. Thank you so much. One of my other bosses used to say, have an insatiable appetite for growth. Just do not, and my principal, she's late. She said, never be satisfied with anything less than, the moral goodness and the capacity that God has given you. And I think if you are that person who is just constantly trying to push the envelope, constantly trying to figure out, how can I grow? Even when you're unemployed, it sets you apart. Absolutely. It really makes you better. So whether you're in the workplace, whether you're outside of it, whether you're trying to transition out, how can you become better? I think it all goes back to our own development plans. What's your personal development plan? What's your career development plan? How can you make yourself better? How can you contribute more? What can you do on weekends, to different organizations? So that really, I think what I see it as is you're adding color to your CV, but you're also adding color to your persona, so that we can all have the same degree, but when I speak to you as a recruiter, you're like, and then I also serve on this board at church, and I also work with this organization, and things like that. It just adds more color to you, and it really sets you apart. Thank you so much for tuning in to An Extraordinary Take. I really hope that this was helpful for you. I've learned so much, and if you had a little pin drop and you realize that you might be the toxic employee, I hope you can self-reflect. It happens to the best of us, and really figure out how to be better, so that when you get those new opportunities, you can add value, man, and you can bring some fresh air. Sometimes I feel like we're not growing in our spaces because of our own personal limitations. So here's to really constantly figuring out how to better ourselves so that we can set ourselves better for success. Until next week, goodbye.